Okay, so today we're doing an analysis of British political parties and asking what are the traditional functions of political parties and to what extent do they perform them. So, looking at their roles and functions, the first ones are representation and participation. So parties are intended to represent the views and opinions of ordinary people. The public can directly participate in the political system by joining a political party. People vote in a general election to elect members of Parliament to the House of Commons. That represents a specific area or constituency. MPs consult with local people and raise any issues with the government. At a local level, party members can stand for election as councillors or mayors and influence local policy. And the views of local people are represented by voting for which councillors they would like to govern. People can campaign for a party, put party branding on their cars or in their homes, and donate to a party whose policies they support. So, looking at the next role and function, a very important one, governing, recruiting and policy formation. So, when MPs are elected, they take a seat in Parliament. And the party leader becomes the Prime Minister if they get the most seats in Parliament. This provides clear leadership and accountability for the country. Government ministers and shadow cabinet members are also recruited from senior membership of the party. Also, the House of Lords. Not all the Lords, some of the Lords are appointed from major political parties. A party's manifesto forms new laws, regulations and policies. And having a majority in Parliament allows new laws to pass very easily. Government's policies ideally reflect the will of the people, as citizens voted for a party based on their manifesto. Another key role here would be checks and balances. So this is an opposition party, the second largest party. They hold the government to account, and they do so by providing a clear alternative vision for the country, different policies essentially. At Prime Minister's questions, held regularly, this allows the opposition leader to ask other MPs probing questions of the Prime Minister. The opposition puts pressure on the government to be effective and openly criticises them. If the governing party collapses or loses its overall majority, the opposition must be ready. They must be ready to take charge. The transfer of power can be done quickly and peacefully, and this provides vital stability to a democracy. Okay, so let's take a look at some of these political parties. Starting with the people in charge, the Conservative Party. You can see their logo just up here. They're considered right-wing or centre-right. They have a greater emphasis on the private sector over the public, sometimes referred to as neoliberalism. The party is very shaped by Thatcher in the 1980s, Margaret Thatcher, obviously, and they drifted away from being the party of the upper class towards notions of fiscal and personal responsibility. They have a preference of lower taxation, less state investment, and more emphasis on the role of the individual. They are one of the oldest political parties in the world, actually, and often also appeal to traditional notions of hierarchy, military, and patriotism. Since 2010, their flagship policy has been austerity. This is all about reducing government spending, reducing the size of the state, and investing in businesses rather than the public sector. Okay, so now let's look at the opposition. The Labour Party. Considered left-wing or centre-left. As I said, current opposition. They focus on state intervention to reduce poverty, inequality and disease. They do this by taxation. They're party of the working class and linked to trade unions. And during the 90s and the noughties, were moved slightly to the centre under Tony Blair. Since 2015, they have returned back to their left-wing origins under Jeremy Corbyn. They founded public services such as the NHS, and they continue to champion these services. They have much more focus on investing money, obviously through taxation, to solve systemic problems, rather than encouraging citizens to take personal responsibility. Okay, one more political party we're going to look at is the Scottish National Party. They represent Scottish nationalism and are sort of centre-left in terms of policy. They obviously support a Scotland independent of the United Kingdom, and they're very popular with the 45% of Scots that voted for independence in 2014. They're very critical of Westminster-centric or London-centric politics. They oppose militarism, want to end Trident, and they also oppose austerity, particularly the austerity imposed on Scotland from Westminster. They favour public investment and also champion free university tuition and a public NHS. The final party we're going to look at today will be the Liberal Democrats. These are considered centre or centre-left. They evolved out of the Liberal Party, one of the oldest parties in Britain, and they highlight the importance of individual liberty and freedom. They support some state intervention, but only if liberty is not affected. Individual liberty is the key here. They oppose government surveillance and champion civil rights. The party did have quite a lot of electoral success in the noughties until 2010. Nick Clegg entered a coalition government with the Conservatives, which was actually a very unpopular decision among Lib Dem voters. Okay, so how well do these parties serve their roles and functions? Let's have a look at some of these parties again and evaluate how well they serve the traditional roles and functions outlined earlier in the presentation. So, going back to people in government, the Conservative Party. In terms of representation, their brand of individualism, patriotism and fiscal responsibility does seem to represent the views of voters in rural or suburban England. They perform very well in those areas. Their vision is not shared in urban areas or Wales. In terms of participation, their party membership is 124,000, which is much lower than that of Labour or the SNP. This suggests there are some barriers to participation in the party. In terms of recruitment, the party often attracts affluent and well-educated membership, considered ready to govern, essentially. Bred for power, some people call it. They have provided countless effective government ministers, lords, mayors and MPs in the party's history, including obviously Winston Churchill, who's one of the most famous Conservative statesmen. Looking at how they govern and policy formation, they're one of the most electorally successful political parties in the world. They've been a very, very old party and they've won many, many, many elections. Their laissez-faire attitude was the dominating ideology of government, basically, until the 20th century. And even now, their free market, Thatcherite policies since the 80s continue to be influential globally. And they've also been in government for the past 8 years, since 2010. Their policies have truly shaped the landscape of British history. Recently, though, a miscalculated snap election in 2017 did cost the party its majority in Parliament, so now they rely on the support of the DUP, which are a Northern Irish party. And current polling shows the Conservative Party might lose a general election to the Labour Party, if it was to be called tomorrow. Looking now at the opposition, the Labour Party. In terms of representation, they began as a party to represent the needs of lower income working people, and to a large extent they still serve that function. They're very successful in urban areas and deindustrialised towns and anywhere with a history of trade unionism. They do struggle to adequately reflect the views of the rural middle class. Rural areas, affluent areas, the Labour Party does not do well, generally speaking. In terms of participation, their party membership is around 570,000. This makes them the largest political party in Europe, and they have a very high level of participation all across the party. In terms of recruitment, they provide ministers and mayors from a range of backgrounds, and all the major mayoral positions are currently held by Labour. Oh, this might go off the screen slightly, but that just says, since 2015, unfortunately, internal party politics has resulted in some resignations from the shadow cabinet. Okay, now looking at how they govern. As we mentioned, they're currently in opposition, so they have no direct control over policy. But throughout the 20th century, Labour's policies included the formation of the NHS, funding the BBC, mass building of homes, and the introduction of the minimum wage. Very, very key policies in British history. They're credited with helping to lift millions out of poverty during the post-war period, known as the post-war consensus. But they're sometimes criticised for being irresponsible with money, essentially, giving too much power to the trade unions also. In terms of checks and balances, in opposition, and currently in opposition, they do seem to be effective in challenging the government. They present a clear alternative to the Conservative manifesto and are regularly critical of austerity, the Conservatives' flagship policy. Polling shows that they could win an election if it was called tomorrow, so they are keeping the government on their toes. Some critics, apologies, off screen again, some critics believe the party has moved too far to the left because Tony Blair, the most successful Labour Prime Minister electorally, won from the centre essentially. So some people believe they've moved too far to the left under Jeremy Corbyn. Looking now at the Scottish National Party. So how do they do in representation? They only really represent the votes of those in Scotland and those who seek to represent, Scotland independent from the UK. Excuse me. They do reflect a left-leaning tendency in Scotland, particularly in the towns and cities, Glasgow and Edinburgh. By definition, they fail to represent anyone outside Scotland. In terms of participation, their membership is 125,000, just above the Conservatives. And this is impressive considering the size of Scotland and Scotland's population. They do also have some grassroots activism in Holyrood, which is their devolved parliament in Scotland, and also in Westminster. In terms of recruitment, they could never produce ministers unless they went into coalition with another party. Scotland just isn't big enough, there aren't enough MPs to form a government in Westminster. They do provide ministers and leaders for Holyrood though, and do so effectively. Now, in terms of governing, as we said, they form policy in Holyrood, which is the devolved parliament in Scotland, and Nicola Sturgeon is the first minister of Scotland. But they could never govern in Westminster. In terms of checks and balances, as the third biggest party, they've been very, very effective in highlighting the needs of the Scottish people. And they've done that to the Conservatives, to Labour. They've made the needs of the Scottish people definitely felt within Westminster. And they have criticised the old traditions of Westminster, the archaic traditions. Obviously, it's a very old institution. And the SNP do criticise the lack of consideration for areas outside what they call the Westminster bubble. And they have been quite effective in campaigning for increased devolution of powers to Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Okay, so now, almost there, we're going to look at the final party here, the Liberal Democrats, and how they fulfil their roles and functions. So the Liberal Democrats represent the views, generally speaking, of educated middle-class voters these days. They tend to avoid radical left and radical right, always adopting a more centrist approach. But this attracts swing voters. They do rarely appeal to the working class voters or voters in Scotland and Wales. In terms of participation, party membership stands at 99,200. Not so many, but I think their members are quite active nationally. In terms of recruitment, the Liberal Party, the historic forefather of the Lib Dems, has provided many, many statesmen. And currently they have control of some local councils, but unfortunately, considering their electoral success, they can't really have many mayoral positions or ministerial positions. Looking now to how they would govern. As we said, the Liberal Party was successful throughout history, but they did collapse as the opposition to the Conservatives in the 1920s. And since then, they've only really ruled as a minority party in coalition governments. And their most recent time was 2010 to 2015. And Deputy Prime Minister Clegg, unfortunately, he did little to influence the Conservatives during his time in government. The Conservatives just dominated policy, essentially. In terms of checks and balances, in the early 2000s, they did quite effectively oppose the Iraq War, unfortunately, which still went ahead, and held the Labour government to account. But right now, as the fourth party, they currently exert little influence in Westminster. Okay, so, in conclusion, the political parties of Britain, they are imperfect, but they do seem to represent a diverse range of opinions whilst all respecting the fundamental tenets of democracy. Nobody's advocating for fascism or communism. Everybody seems to respect the democracy that we have. Political participation continues to thrive and is even increasing in some sections of the population. And laws and policies are still drawn up based on promises made in a party's manifesto, although it is the case that parties do sometimes betray manifesto commitments. It does happen. Overall, the traditional functions of political parties are operating in a healthy manner, suggesting that the bedrock of British democracy is stable, for now at least. Okay, thank you very much for listening. Cheers.